Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We are discussing how to set up your SharePoint environment so that records management is easy. I will be covering some best practices, configuration tips, and governance. Just a couple of notes. We have a lot to cover, so I'll get going here. Just quickly remind everybody that there is a Q&A section, so just take a moment, locate that button, make sure you can find it, and feel free to ask questions or share comments as we go, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. And we'll also be sharing the recording and the slides after this webinar, so watch your email for that. So our topic today is all about tips and tricks for structuring SharePoint to play well for records management. We put in a few takeaways here. What we want you to walk away with some best practices, some ideas, some tips for how to configure SharePoint for different departments, different teams to enable records management. And then we'll give some configuration guidance and tips as well and design patterns. And feel free to ask questions about that as we go through. We know that there can always be exceptions in cases, and you might have a specific scenario in mind. And we'll also touch on governance as well, especially for SharePoint content types. So now I'll pass it over to Michael.
Thanks, Jess. And I apologize if I sound sick today. I'm just recovering from something. I don't know what it is, but nevertheless, if I go mute, it's because I'm coughing in the background. So Michael Schweitzer, President and CEO of Gravity Union. And in short, I've been doing sort of compliance-focused implementations of SharePoint to the Microsoft 365 platform for the past 15 years. It's become a bit of a passion of mine. And we're kind of sharing our golden nuggets for how to make sure that your compliance-focused Microsoft 365 and SharePoint projects go well, and where we can meet around compliance. A little bit about us. We are a Microsoft Gold partner. We're sort of across Canada, working with organizations across Canada, lots in the government sector, both provincial, federal, municipal sector, as well as the public sector. We're also a Gold certified Clever partner as well. So we do both Microsoft 365 security and compliance projects, now called Purview, as well as Collabspace projects for Microsoft 365. We're best place to work, which is really great. I'm really proud of that. And then really kind of our services are across the board. So we kind of do everything. Some of our clients will engage with us for multi-year projects where we're doing visioning and planning and strategy, design, building and evolving. And then sometimes we do the entire project, and sometimes we partner with organizations to help them get started and then take the training wheels off and support them from the sidelines. Just some fun stats that we'll have a quiz at the end of the webinar for. So let's jump into it. How do we set up SharePoint, and how do we govern SharePoint to make records management easy? It's not always intuitive. So there's certainly a Venn diagram of overlapping concepts that we have to be cognizant about. But certainly start kicking things off, one of the most important things is governance. So understanding our roles, responsibilities, guidelines in terms of who's doing what in the system. It shouldn't be the Wild West. Keep in mind that SharePoint is really a skill that is mastered over time, which is often overlooked by organizations. Oftentimes, no one needs training on network file storage or email, and sometimes organizations take that mindset moving forward. But you certainly do want to kind of build up that SharePoint skill to master the platform. It's certainly better if a kind of designated team does the rollout for all of the departments to ensure that we have consistency throughout the organization versus having departments go off on their own without oversight or guidance. We sort of see that being one of the biggest issues in today is just handing the keys over to the departments, letting them create their own Frankensites, and then it's really hard to govern that type of solution from a compliance, from a privacy perspective, or from a records perspective as well. Take some planning and preparation. So oftentimes you want to sit down and have some meetings with the organization and work out what your governance structure is going to be and who's going to be involved in the project and what will people's roles and responsibilities be as you move forward. Oftentimes we'll craft them kind of racy and really kind of get down to the details to make sure there's no ambiguity in terms of who is doing what throughout the implementation. And then guidelines. So we've put a lot of thought into this, and we've kind of got all our best practices documented. But the idea is that there's lots of, SharePoint's been around for almost a quarter century, and people who maybe learned SharePoint 10 years ago, maybe they've learned best practices that were okay 10 years ago, but are no longer best practices in terms of scalability and usability and all that kind of good stuff. And so We certainly feel it's important to dive into the kind of key topics around your implementation to make sure you have a shared understanding of perhaps contentious or religious type decisions. So information architecture, what is our standard design practice? When are we using hub sites? Are we using sub-sites? Are we standardizing on the content type hubs? What's our security posture? Are we open or closed by default? You're working through all of these key decisions up front will make the project itself much easier. We'll ensure consistency across the organization. We'll ensure that we're always giving the same answers to end users across the enterprise. Certainly having different answers can spook people or end users. So working through the key things, and we think those are information architecture. So what does your navigation look like? What does our taxonomy look like? What do our lists and libraries look like? How do we leverage content types, manage metadata, drop-down lists, etc. Security, so are we doing SharePoint groups or AD groups or a combination thereof, or M365 groups? Privacy, taking into account what we call applied records management. So you may have a file plan, but that file plan may not respect the collaboration window. How long do you let content sit there before it gets classified, or before we lock it down as a record, or are we locking things down as records? We have the option now in most platforms to simply preserve the content without locking it down, which makes maintenance easier. So making sure we really understand what we're doing across all these major components: migration, change management, governance, etc. It's not a one size fits all. So just note that, typically department sites that that sort of long living content, the list of employee files that may live, probably live in perpetuity for as long as our organization does. And so that's going to require the most governance, because you're going to want to make sure that we have the most scalability, the most usability, and not have that solution degrade over time. Project sites, typically a little bit of governance goes a long way. We want to have the consistency, but you typically don't want to do 2 or 3 weeks or even a month of analysis and design for a specific project site, because that project wants to get going. And even one-off temporary, just make sure we govern the creation of it, and beyond that, you're probably not getting a whole lot of value out of trying to govern that stuff. So if you've created a Halloween employee or Halloween party management site, just go and create a new team set for them and be done with it. What does what does lack of proper governance look like? So if you're in your organization and you see these things, these could be indications that perhaps you don't have your governance dialed in. So the first thing would be unhappy users. If people are complaining about the searchability or the organization of content, they can't find your stuff and you're seeming frustrated, chances are we didn't have our governance dialed in. Departments design their own sites without oversight. So we see this quite often where a site is provisioned, we hand the keys over to the department and they get to go and create their own content. Chances are they're using folders and they haven't dialed in the solution from a scalability standpoint, from a security standpoint. And chances are they're going to have a different solution than other departments will, say for policies, which makes it much more difficult to manage the content from a record standpoint. Sometimes we'll see organizations try to create a template that will magically fit the needs of every department, and certainly the correct approach is the balance between those two. So you want to partner with the business, design a solution for them, reuse reusable components when we can, and then when we need to break out of the mold and create bespoke solutions to meet their specific needs. And every department has different needs. That just really makes sense. And then also not centralizing or standardizing our configuration. So if you see any of these things happening in your organization, chances are your governance needs a little bit of rework. Second point, focusing on the end user experience. We've done a whole webinar on this and we put a link there in the deck. But certainly a more dialed in user experience, the happier end users are, the less requests that we get to rework the solution, the easier records management is over the long run. So that is to say, we don't want to, we have a whole topic on this on lifting and shifting, but we don't want to dump the content in. We do want to design this solution following best practices up front. And what our experience has been is the more we focus on the end user experience, that has always led us to have enough detail to automate compliance behind the scenes. We've never had a case where the user experience didn't allow us to classify the content into the right record category and meet needs around compliance as well. So there's a link to the YouTube video we have around crafting that kind of very thoughtful and deliberate user experience for end users that also lends itself well to records management. Favorite in-place records. So we're still seeing this where organizations are crafting a record center off to the side where we're sending records that will live outside of their natural environment. And notably, trying to get the records into the record center can be a lot of effort. Typically requires some kind of manual intervention. If it's not explicitly moving it there, it could be setting a metadata value, running a workflow. Note that especially within Microsoft 365, if I move content between site collections, I lose continuity in the audit trail for that document. So if I have a policy or procedure that someone approved in one document library, and then we decide to store it in just a central place for all records, for say policies, for example, I will actually lose the continuity of the audit trail from Microsoft 365. The SharePoint unique ID, provided you have the right features turned on, will follow that document from site to site. However, from an audit trail perspective, in the back end, it won't actually persist. It certainly makes records harder to find, so it's annoying for end users if I have a document that needs to be a record to move it away from where I want to use and create it and move it out of the business solution into more of a record solution. And of course, we'll have exceptions for obsolete content or superseded content, or perhaps old content that we're just storing for the purposes of compliance. And we may make some exceptions for that, but typically we want to create the business solution, have people collaborate in SharePoint, and then classify that content in place and manage it as a record in place as much as we possibly can. Fourth point is centralized and standardized configuration. And so the idea is that SharePoint does have two personalities. So it can be this wild west, and we can empower and enable the business to create their own SharePoint sites and do all kinds of cool stuff, which is an interesting concept. But if our goal is to meet our needs around records management, the more inconsistency we have across the environment, the more difficult records management becomes. And so we can have either a decentralized approach where we're not governing that configuration, or we can have a centralized approach where we govern our configuration. So typically what this looks like is we do have this notion of a content type hub. Now it's called the content type gallery in SharePoint Online, which is a central location where we define our content types. So our contracts, our invoices, our policies and procedures, and where we get to reuse that configuration across multiple sites within SharePoint. You can hear some construction being done in our building right now, so if you hear that, I apologize. And so you're leveraging managed metadata where appropriate, which is the list of drop-downs that we have across organization, like clients or vendors or departments and stuff like that. And so we can certainly script or template our content types, but that doesn't preclude us from also having those in the content type hub. And I can't stress this enough. So, for example, here's just maybe a site diagram of a big SharePoint implementation where each of these little nodes might be a departmental site and lists and libraries and so on and so forth. And we might have various locations where we have policies across the enterprise. When that is the case, if we're not governing our solution and we have decentralized configuration, we'll end up with different solutions across the enterprise, different content types, folder structures, meta, etc., which makes things a little bit harder to manage or govern from an enterprise standpoint, especially from a records management standpoint. When we have, and so what this could look like is we have, in one location, I've got a governing documents library, and I'm using folders to denote if it's a policy or procedure. And in another location, maybe you have a document library called policies, and all my policies are listed there. And so you might have different permutations, different content types, different metadata in the different areas, all trying to manage our policies throughout the enterprise. Now, a centralized configuration will ensure that we're reusing our policies across all of our SharePoint implementation and have that consistency. We have the same user experience, we have the same configuration. And so, every site's going to look exactly the same from that standpoint. We'll have the same solution deployed across the enterprise for IT policies and HR policies, so on and so forth. And then when we get to something like records management, I can do, this is an example of a content rule in Collabspace, which will go off and find content that we can map back to a record category. And so if we have governed our solution, and if every policy has the same content type, I can create a very simple rule that goes and finds every document with the content type called policy and map this back to our policies and procedures record category in our file plan. which is a very, very powerful thing to do. But then when we stand up a new departmental site and we give them a policy library and we ensure that we govern it and we use that policy content type, our content type is going to work immediately, which is amazing. So very, very minimal maintenance from a record standpoint, as well as increasing our ability to meet our needs around compliance. So again, think about that. We have those different locations. We're trying to find stuff in an ungoverned context. It's going to be much, much more difficult to govern those things. We're going to create a different rule for each location that we move forward on. Even from an e-discovery standpoint, or just doing some testing, I can go off and create my rule and see every policy that's going to match that rule, which is great. Again, in a decentralized solution where we have different types of solutions across the enterprise, I'm going to have to say, well, look for this folder name and look for this content type or look for this library name. And you might end up having to have, say, 24 different rules to manage that content. And then if a new department rolls out and we're not governing their solution, you're going to have to go back in and add a new rule to manage the policies for that new department. So again, a lot of overhead, way more difficult to try and govern and manage that stuff over time. Also, from an e-discovery standpoint, so not only do we get benefits from a classification standpoint, but doing e-discovery, so going off and doing a search, hey, go fetch me every policy across the enterprise. Again, it can be quite easy. This is with the Microsoft 365 e-discovery area, or in Collabspace. I'm going to go do a new events query. I'm going to go look for every document that has a policy, and then I can do an export. I can place that content on hold, etc. So lots of dimensions of compliance become easier when we have this highly governed, centralized configuration of our SharePoint environment. And we can do all kinds of cool stuff. End users can find policies more easily. We can also do cool stuff like, for example, if we have that same solution across the enterprise, I can create a policies portal and then list and group policies by department. And the content doesn't have to live there, but can be a centralized location for our employees to reference those policies, say, for an employee portal. So the key kind of benefits of centralized configuration, again, we can more easily apply value-add solutions like records management, privacy, sensitivity, workflow, integration, when we have a standardized centralized configuration, and just, to further that, workflows, for example, will often target a specific content type. And so if we have 10 different policy content types or a lack of content type for policies, it means that I'm going to have to create 10 different workflows if we wanted to have some kind of rich approval process or standard process. We have a consistent user experience. So if I get transferred from one department to another, and I can go find their policy area, I'm going to know how that content looks and behaves, how I can search and sort and filter for it. It's going to be easier to find that content. So from an e-discovery standpoint or from an end user standpoint, trying to find our time off policy will be easier. We can create those cross-departmental solutions. So go ahead and create that policies portal that can list and iterate all of our approved policies in one location. And so I don't have to remember if was this policy managed by HR or was it managed by IT? Certainly easier to create reports. So if you wanted to have take Power BI, point that to all of your policies, document libraries, and have a list of the ones that are expired or up for review, et cetera, et cetera. So again, really enabling the business to add more value and give them more value in how we provide insights on that content, as well as perhaps take some of the guesswork out of enterprise versus non-enterprise configuration. So we do see this sometimes where people try and gamify a little bit and say, well, I don't think that anyone else is going to need this type of content type, but then sometimes you're wrong, and then going to fix it after the fact can be time consuming. You have to write PowerShell scripts to redo your content types, etc. So if we just always go to the content type gallery, aka content type hub, do our configuration there and ensure that we're always reusing that stuff across the enterprise, there's little back and forth, there's less design decisions. We have this one location, this one source of truth for all of our content types. That's a pretty powerful story in terms of governing your SharePoint implementation. A document library should serve as a single purpose. There are 100 different ways that we can configure SharePoint, and of those, arguably, 80 are wrong and 20 are right. And of the 20 that are right, there are some that lend themselves more for scalability, searchability, usability, and compliance, etc. And so, we've certainly seen this before where departments are given a SharePoint site and the end user isn't aware that they can even create new document libraries. And so they end up recreating a messy folder structure within a single document library. And document libraries have limitations in terms of the number of default items that can be displayed in a view and the total number and the volume of content within a document library and the number of views for a document library, so on and so forth. So document libraries as site collections, they are a point of scalability and really allow us to dial in the user experience. So, for example, we have a list of role descriptions or job descriptions here, which is great. And this is sort of what we want. But if you see something like this, where we're starting to mix the types of content that we have in that document library, like I've got role descriptions and contracts. So, in the case of a contract, you're probably going to have a client that the contract is with, but you're not going to have a role type. There's no notion of a contract being full-time or part-time. And so, when we start to mix the metaphors of content within a document library, and we need to show the meaningful metadata, we're going to see gaps in metadata. It becomes a much more disjointed end user experience. You have to create different views for that content, and it just kind of loses its value. Document libraries really were designed to have a single type of content: invoices, contracts, policies, procedures, so on and so forth. So we can go off and create different views and try and interpret that out still. Also note that the views, so the views are a way that we can display the data. So for example, I can show you all of the unpaid invoices versus the paid invoices. I can group stuff by vendor, group stuff by client. You do have a limit to the number of views that we can create for a given library. I believe it's 20, it could be mistaken. Things are always changing in the cloud. But that being said, if we, oftentimes a given type of content may require a half dozen or a dozen different views to make it really meaningful. The larger the volume of content, the more views you're going to have. And so if we're putting in different types of content that require different types of metadata, and you end up having like 10 different types of content in one given document library, you will run out of views that you can create for that content. And so you're going to have to stop, you're going to have to go and redesign that, you're going to have to go and move a bunch of content out of there. And really you're creating a bunch of potential work in the future for the organization. And of course, if you have records management configured for this library or for the content type, etc., and you're having to restructure that content 6 months from now, you're going to have to go back in and reconfigure the records management auto classification areas within whatever product you happen to be using. There's also, not that we recommend this, but, a very simple way to classify stuff with M365. I can go to a given library. I can apply a label to items in this list or library and go ahead and choose whatever record category we want. So, even Microsoft sort of has this idea that, everything in a given document library probably going to have the same kind of nature, should probably be the same type of content. Excuse me, moving forward. So some anti-patterns, if you're seeing things like we've got a drop-down list of document types, or you have all kinds of weird different types of content in there, it may be an indication, not always, but typically contracts, you're going to want to have a workflow, invoices may have a workflow, they're going to have different metadata, etc. So be very careful about it. There certainly are exceptions. So an employee file is a good exception where I probably don't need to capture the any more detailed metadata on an employee file that lives in an employee file, say the employment contract and resume, other than the employee name and the department, etc. So we have some questions to ask yourself. So, you have a document library that you want to use, and is it a large volume of content? You may want to just put your thinking cap on and just make sure that we don't have multiple sort of different types of content in there. Do we have different classifications within one document library? That could be an indication that we have too many types of content there. Are there lots of views required? Are you going to hit that 20 view threshold? Do we have different metadata required per document type? So, invoices may have an invoice due date and an invoice amount, and contracts may have a vendor name. And if we have those mixed metaphors of content in one document library, again, could be problematic. Do we need to have different workflows for document type as well? So if more of these questions are true, then chances are you may want to separate this out over multiple document libraries. And again, it may be okay at first, but then putting our ECM hats on and thinking about what does this content look like 5 years from now, and is there a chance that we're going to have to move some of the content out in the future, perhaps disrupting our current configuration of records, something to be very careful about. Again, single purpose libraries, we ensure that we don't have to restructure content down the road, or else we minimize the chances of that happening. It'll be much easier for end users to remember where content lives. It does streamline the end user experience. I don't typically have to choose the content type or choose the document type within a given library. It's going to minimize the number of available views that we have to select from, as well as reducing the chances that we'll hit that threshold. There's no confusion around what metadata to show or to not show. So, and we're not going to be showing metadata that doesn't make sense for a given document within the library. And to note too, so I think the limit for a given view within a document library in SharePoint Online is 5,000. And in SharePoint on premises, that was a threshold that we could bump up. This is actually a hard limit now. So if you think you're going to have more than 5,000 documents in the library, we may want to separate that over multiple document libraries. Avoid folders. Folders are brittle. They're too easy to change and they're too hard to govern. So if you are using the name of a folder, for example, for your record classification, and someone decides to change a folder called policies that you've mapped to and change that to procedures and policies, that's going to break your auto classification. It really does open up the solution to more human error. So typing out the name of a folder is going to be much more prone to human error than it will be to select from a drop-down list. It's going to limit how we can view the content. So when we are leveraging folders, and when we're leveraging folders, typically it's just metadata, right? So it's going to be a year, it's going to be a client name. And so it's going to limit our ability to show you different views of that content. So show me all the content by vendor name versus by due date, whatever. Chances are we'll end up with empty folders, and it just will involve more clicking around, which we know for the most part is a more frustrating end user experience. And we still have intuitive buckets within SharePoint. So, if you think about the K drive or network file storage location, you're going to have the root of the drive. You're going to have a subfolder for human resources, perhaps a subfolder for recruiting, perhaps a subfolder for job descriptions or role descriptions. And then, maybe you have a folder for department. And typically it's those last couple of layers that we want to promote to be metadata. So in looking at SharePoint Online, that first level is just SharePoint itself. That second level is maybe that kind of master hub site. We then have that other site that rolls up to that hub site. Then we'll have that document library. And then we get that down to the kind of last level. We want to promote that to be metadata. So that department should really become metadata moving forward. Here's an example. I'm got job descriptions and I'm just creating a bucket per department. There's nothing stopping me from putting in, the wrong spelling for that. It's very, very hard to govern folders. And again, the name of the folder may be how we're classifying stuff against the platform. Again, we're limiting our ability to view stuff. So once I'm down, if I'm clicked through a folder called HR, I can only view the HR stuff, but I can't. And from this view, I can't see the stuff. I can't group, search, sort, and filter by other metadata. Versus if we have, we take that department, move it out of the folder sense, and maybe we're adding other things, role type. I can now do things like group by department and then group by role type. So we still have sort of a very similar experience in being able to group, search, sort, and filter that content, but a very much more powerful ability to do that stuff. So now I can group by role type. I can filter by role type. I can filter by department. I can do all kinds of stuff. So here we're going to group by role type, full-time and part-time. We can filter by department. I can do all kinds of cool stuff. I can filter by role. So much more powerful experience. And again, we're going to have more consistency throughout a configuration. And when I do a content rule to match a content from a record standpoint, if I'm matching on the department name consulting, I can certainly trust that every document that has department attached to it will have the correct spelling. Versus if we have folders, then there's going to be a chance or degree that someone has fat fingered that and have an issue there. So the benefits of not using folders, it's easier, more consistent classification of content for records of privacy. It's going to be easier, more cost-effective from an e-discovery standpoint. We're going to get more consistency of solutions made across the enterprise. So if you have a rule of thumb that we're not going to use folders, that will sort of force you to do better practices in terms of content types, lists and libraries, and so on and so forth. And then that business value, reporting, searching, sorting, filtering, workflows, integration, stuff like that becomes more evident, and end users will get more value out of the solution as well. Designed to minimize maintenance. So the more that a solution changes over time, then the more effort it takes for records people to do their job. So if I go and build out a file plan in M365 or Collabspace, and I map that to my SharePoint content, and then the end users don't like the solution, and we have to restructure it, I'm going to have to go and redo my record classifications. I might have to stop some workflows. There's going to be a lot of overhead that we incur when we have to restructure our content. So the idea is that we want to roll up our sleeves and create a solution that will never have to be modified in the future. So we've already talked about some of that stuff, user experience, avoiding folders, centralizing configuration. Other considerations are certainly scalability and security. So from a scalability standpoint, again, we have these different thresholds and limitations. A given site collection, or now we call them sites, can only have so much content in them. A list or library can only have so much content in them. More importantly, the view thresholds of 5,000 is another good indication. And so taking scalability into account, putting our long-term ECM hats on, what does this solution look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now? What's the volume of content that's going to be created for this list or library, and taking that into consideration so that we don't have to go and restructure content in the future, because it's going to be problematic from a compliance standpoint. So, anticipating what will that content look like 5, 10, 20 years out. Typically, we target 5,000 to 10,000 documents per document library. They can stretch, I think it's 30 million, but at that point, things kind of slow down. We know some bugs that show up in the interface. You can no longer break inheritance from a security standpoint. So we get a whole bunch of issues when we go to larger scale. If it's just going to be a place for content to go and die, it's probably fine. But if it's an active list or library that people will be using on a regular basis, really try and limit down to that 5, 10, maybe 20,000, but try and avoid going over that. Certainly favor auto scaling. So, if I'm able to move content out of a library to a different location for perhaps some semi-active invoices can be sent to a different document library where we need to reference it less, then maybe we can have content go there and live for the rest of their life. But that kind of current library that people use on a daily basis can be limited to 5,000 or 10,000 documents. And then, certainly if we do need, from a scalability standpoint, to create new lists or libraries. So we have invoices for 2010 and then invoices for 2011, where each of those becomes a document library, making sure that we're automating that process. So you're going to want to have a button to say create new year for invoices and have it create the library and assign the content type and create the views automatically. Because if we rely on that person, who knows 10 years from now what their SharePoint training is going to be, and they may not remember to put that proper configuration there. Security is certainly another consideration. So making sure we understand who needs to access this content, and if there's some solution designs where we need to, or if we're constantly breaking security or inheritance and stuff like that, then our solution probably can be rethought to make sure that we're going to minimize the amount of breaking inheritance or restructuring content to take into account security. Include records management input and design. So certainly it's healthy to have the records management team be part of deployments. We want to have their input. So IT or the information management group, whoever happens to be running the project, should involve RM upfront as much as possible, so that you understand what's happening. So you'll have the opportunity to make sure we classify the content correctly. And then if there is some unique cases, it's very seldom, but there may be one more piece of meta that you need to properly classify that content in there. It'll give you the opportunity to kind of raise that concern. Don't lift and shift. This is one of the biggest problems we see in organizations, especially in the pandemic, where, hey, we now have to work from home. And so we're going to put everything into SharePoint Online, avoid having to use a VPN. So we have this, this old network file storage system. It's kind of messy. We have contracts v1, contracts v2, contracts final, final_final, Mike's copy, Jazz's copy, Mark's copy, etc. And then we move that into SharePoint. If we simply just dump it in there as is, we're really not solving any problems. And in fact, we're probably incurring a cost. SharePoint is a slightly heavier platform to use in network file storage. There's a cost. Now I have to open a browser. Now I have to navigate. It's a bit more sticky. You can't just drag and drop folders around, and you have to enter in metadata, etc. So there's a slight cost to that, to moving to SharePoint. And if we haven't done a proper design, the end users are getting all of the drawbacks of SharePoint and really none of the benefits. Versus, taking the time to organize that content as movement to SharePoint. The end users love it. It's easier to find their content, search, sort, and filter for it, and as well as for us to apply later on records management. So lift and shift, we kind of rush into it. We just kind of dump content into SharePoint. It becomes very hard to govern, can create a frustrating end user experience that may create a steeper change management curve when you have to go back to the organization and re-implement SharePoint. We'll need to circle back at some point to fix it anyways. Typically, it's more cost effective to just get it right the first time because, again, content is a bit more sticky and less movable once it is in SharePoint. And again, typically we'll probably see decreased compliance because trying to classify records in a messy situation is always going to be a bit difficult. Certainly auto-classify everything, manual classification as needed. Typically, end users don't really care about records management. So as much as we can, we don't want to have that burden of end users having to manually classify stuff. And even when they do, they typically get it wrong. That was the whole notion of creating a big box file plan. Typically, solutions that are properly designed, in our experience, we've done hundreds of projects now, they never need to be manually classified. If you have a solution that's been designed from an end user perspective, from a scalability perspective, from a security perspective, they always have the right level of detail for us to apply auto classification via auto classification rules, or perhaps even some of the cool artificial intelligence coming out. It's probably a good check and balance too. So if you find you have some content that you can auto classify, it could be a signal that you have to go and maybe double check the scalability or the usability of that solution for the end user. Very big buckets are bad. We're seeing a bit of a trend of organizations wanting to further distill their file plans into like maybe a dozen record categories. We have a 7-year category and a 10-year category. And so it's kind of hard. I mean, it's sort of the latest trend, and I'm not totally, we're not totally sure what's going to happen, but certainly it makes me a bit nervous. Big bucket file plans were born out of this frustration of getting end users to classify content against the file plan manually. And so, excuse me. And so, the fact that auto classification is likely going to be the strategy moving forward, there's actually less of a need to go big bucket. I understand we're going to be saving on configuration up front, but really, big bucket came at a compromise. We were losing some of that fine-grained information about the content that the file plan gives us. What's the disposition authority? Who's responsible for approving the content? What's that provision or citation? What's the reason that we have this category in the first place? Even from a e-discovery perspective as well, if we have case files or whatever that may aid in our searchability. So big buckets come in a compromise, and I don't think that compromise is necessary in modern systems. And in fact, that more functional 300 to 400 record categories that are super descriptive are probably better from a long-term perspective. Yes, more work up front, but especially on the back end where now I have to organize that content for disposition approval. If I've got 1 million documents in a disposition workflow and those belong to 50 different departments, I'm really spending a bunch of time trying to organize that content for classification. Also note there are, especially with M365, less so for products like Collabspace, there are limitations in the usage of your record categories. So by default, I can only publish a record category out to 100 sites in SharePoint, which might sound like a lot, but given the best practice within SharePoint Online now, which is to make everything a site, every project will be a site, every working group will be a site. And so you will likely end up with hundreds upon hundreds of SharePoint sites. And if you have some generic record categories like convenience files or transitory stuff, it may be quite difficult to publish out and use those record categories across all of your SharePoint implementation. There's also the limitations in terms of how many contents we can put for auto classification. There's a limit to the number of documents that can get pushed into a workflow. And again, you lose that context of, well, what was the regulatory oversight that made us have this rule in the first place? So that becomes too difficult if you end up with just 12 record categories, a 10-year, 12-year, 20-year, etc. So I would say, big file plans, maybe they're coming back in vogue. And providing some value now that we have removed the issue of end users inaccurately classifying content in the system. So in summary, kind of our key takeaways, set up a clear and effective governance structure. We need roles and responsibilities. We want to partner with the business and create that solution together. We want to focus on the end user experience. We're going to favor in-place records over solutions that have us whisk away all the records to a record center, which get removed from sort of the day-to-day operations of end users. We want to centralize and standardize our configuration across the solution, shoot for a single-purpose document library, avoid folders when possible, design to minimize maintenance, include RM in the design of the solution, don't lift and shift, certainly try and classify everything, no manual classification if we can avoid it. And very big buckets are bad. Yeah, that was like 80 slides in 41 minutes. Hoping to go too fast. I could be have a false sense of time with my sickness. But moving on to any questions that we might have from the audience today.
Yeah, we have a number of questions. I've been trying to keep up with them and answered a few in line. But if you have more questions about content types or custom metadata and adding that, feel free to add those comments in as well. And we'll try to even get to them after the session. But one of the questions that's standing out, we had a couple people ask about the 5,000 limit that you mentioned when you're talking about scalability. So how would one address the 5,000 document limit? What solutions have you seen? For example, we have 6,000 plus docs for our city bylaws. How would we break this up?
Yeah, so it's a Purview, and not to confuse with Microsoft Purview, but it's Purview. So if there's a way to group those bylaws by department or owner or topic or some kind of thing, then you can create, say, 10 different views to group that content for that. Yeah, it's a great question. But yeah, you're gonna look to how do we slice and dice that content and create views to limit the number of documents showing up in at a given point in time.
Excellent. I have another comment here. This is from just a comment from Kat. Maybe we can discuss it as well. M365 Content Hub. I think Content Type Hub breaks a lot. I just wanted to mention or call that one out because it is the content type gallery now. It's been modernized for SharePoint Online, and it does function a bit differently. So I don't know if you have a comment on that, Michael.
Yeah. So actually, if you go and look at the documentation now, so there were some issues with content type publishing where, if you had a local column that had the same name, you get a naming collision. It would take a long time for the content types to get published out and stuff like that. So they've redesigned content type publishing. I go to the content type hub. It still is, you can get to it from the same URL from the content type hub URL. And when I create the content type there and publish it out, I can go directly to my library and say, add this content type. And so they've kind of solved all those, all the issues around the unreliability of content type publishing, if you will. And so we haven't run into any problems with content type publishing since those changes came into effect. I think it was like about a year ago. So yeah, but yeah, certainly understand that, you run into problems and It could take a long time. Once you had like 500 content types, you create a new site collection, it would take a long time. Or if you're using a tool like ShareGate to do content migration and you use that tool too soon, it would look for the content type locally, it wouldn't find it because it hadn't been published out yet, and then it would create local ones. Yeah, so but most of those issues are now addressed with the new design pattern.
Okay, we have a Power Automate question here. So can Power Automate be tied to forms?
Yeah, absolutely. So Power Automate can be tied to forms, create records and stuff like that. Your forms can either be the Microsoft forms or they can be Power Apps, and it can kick off a Power Automate workflow as well. Yeah.
I think I have time for this one, although I may not be understanding it completely, but am I understanding correctly that a library can be a workflow area if the content doesn't sprawl?
Yeah, so typically when we create our workflows are typically content type aware and also typically location aware. And so you might have to export that workflow and publish on multiple locations. It all depends on your design of it. But yeah, our content type's typically content type aware. And so as long as content has the same content type, it makes the workflows themselves easier to create, easier to target that site. If you're going to have different types of content types in the library, and you want the same workflow to run on that stuff, you're going to have little decision trees and if statements and stuff like that, and it just becomes more a bit more tedious to do.
And finally, I think one last question here about records management. So what are your thoughts on auto declaration of records? Should files be uploaded as a draft in one library, and when they're ready to become final records, should that happen in place, or should files be moved / copied into a records library?
Yeah, so good question. So in general, in place is better. We had a couple sort of talks about that. If you were to move content, especially across site collections, again, you'll actually lose the continuity of the audit trail. And so typically what we would do is just have all records in place, classify as soon as possible. And then it's actually the declaration of records becomes another question. So both Microsoft 365 and Collabspace, and I'm assuming other vendors, one lesson learned from a bunch of previous records management projects is that once we declare a record, if it was declared too early, if we're too greedy with our declaration, if you will, and we have to go and undeclare that, that's a significant overhead from the system. And so both, say, Collabspace and M365 allow this notion of a preservation. So with M365, they have a preservation hold library, and they simply have the document there. We classify it, and every time we make an edit to that document, the previous copy is sent to the preservation hold library, which is immutable and can't be changed. And so it kind of strikes a nice balance, perhaps for lower value records where you're not overly concerned and you don't necessarily want a lot of governance around it. That's also an option. But yeah, typically 80-20 rule probably, where most of the content should be in place. It shouldn't move around. It should just stay where it is. There may be some exceptions, like for example, like maybe if you want to have PDF versions of the policies, the original is a Word document, you kick off a workflow so that the local copy gets worked on, you publish it out, a copy of that as in PDF format set to a different library, and that could be declared automatically. Generally speaking, though, as much as you can, have the content in place, it doesn't move, it gets declared, and probably just when that content needs like enterprise consumption, you might argue yourself into a slightly different design pattern.
Perfect.
Lots of good questions today.
Lots of questions. I think we may have more questions than we have time for. So I'm just looking through the new ones. I see some new ones coming through. Should we do one more? We'll do one more. Okay. Can you do auto classification using M365 Purview? Which license is required to be able to use auto classification?
Yeah, so I know this is a confusing topic with licensing in Microsoft 365 and Purview. So yes, you can do auto classification using M365 Purview. Comes in two flavors. We have trainable classifiers whereby we can do artificial intelligence, show examples of resumes, show examples of non-resumes, and then it'll go off and find content across the ether and attempt to classify that stuff there. Works pretty well. Tons of effort up front though to find all that content. It can take 2 weeks to kick in. We can also do search-based classification. It's using KQL, which is a search query language. So for example, you do content type : policy, that will go off and find every document that has a content type policy. Note that with that classification, it does take up for 9 days to kick in from a configuration standpoint, and up to 30 days to kick in to classify content if you're applying it to a large volume of content, if you will. Essentially, the level of license that is required is the E5 or the E5 license, either in the Office domain or the Microsoft domain of licensing. And it's our understanding that basically, if you have an F1 or an F3 or an E1 or an E3 license, you can have read-only to a site collection where we're deploying Purview. And if you're given write access, so if I have an E3 license and I'm given write access to a library, then the auto classification stops working, even if for someone who's adding content that has an E5 license. So in order for you to get the cool auto classification working, you have to have an E5 license, and everyone who's collaborating in that solution needs to have an E5 license. But if people need read-only access, then that's fine. They can go in there. They just can't create net new documents in that site. So maybe you have a HR manages a list of policies, and you expose a view of all the approved policies. Everyone who manages that content will have to have an E5 license, but everyone in the organization can have read-only access to that content moving forward. I hope that answered your question.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for asking those questions. Great interaction. If there's any other things that you want to ask about, feel free to send us a note as well, and send Michael an email, and we'll get back to you. Just as a reminder, I will be sharing the recording and the slides. We'll be sending out an email the next day or so with links to both of those things. So again, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it, and we hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Bye.